As your self-love grows stronger, so do the waves of change that you can create. This limitless love gives us new grace and clarity that help us see ourselves in all other beings and better understand where they are coming from. It gives us the strength to treat all with kindness and support all in living lives in which they no longer cause harm. Unconditional love can bring balance to our world. The clarity it produces can help us better understand the roots of harm and work to eliminate them so that all can have the external freedom needed to work on their own internal liberation. The greed and reactiveness that cause harm can be replaced with love as the primary motivator and responses of kindness as our principal form of action. To create this shift in our world, many will have to heal themselves deeply by doing their inner work, releasing burdens within themselves, and creating enough space so that their own self-love can breathe deeply and expand into unconditional love. All right, thank you for participating in that, however you chose to. We love to open some of our spaces with somatic activities because a lot of this content is very theoretical, but it is also somatic and can bring up a lot, both in terms of resistance or just in terms of activating things for you. And so just to be aware and observant as things are coming up in your body and knowing that you can make space to unpack that later.
And especially because this is going to be recorded, you can feel free to take a break if you need to, come back to content, whatever feels right for you to engage with this information. And I think a highlight from that reading for me is how important the personal work is. I think for us, and I'm sure many people on the call, we work in advocacy and support and working on other folks' things. And it's just, I can't stress enough how important it is to work on our own healing, to work on our own grounding, and practice the things that we suggest other people do. And yeah, Leah's typing in who that was by and what book that is. It's really helpful. Sometimes we, in the beginning of a session, will even just blind open and have that kind of guide the space. We really embrace emergent strategy and kind of letting things come to us in the way that they align with the group that we're working with. And that's a really, really great resource for it because so many of the readings are very short.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So who are we?
Yeah, so now that we're all a little bit more grounded, ready to dive in, we're going to share a bit more about ourselves. So my name is Stas. My full name is Nastasia, but most folks call me Stas. I go by they, them pronouns, and I'm one of the two co-founders and directors at Spring Up. I'm originally from Italy, but I grew up in Miami. And so I'm half Italian, I was born there, and half African American.
My name is Lee. I go by they, them, or he, him pronouns. Either of those is fine. I have been working, founded and have been working for Spring Up for 7 years.
Founded in 2013, right?
Yeah. Is that 7? Yeah. And I am originally from Minnesota. I'm really passionate about individual and collective healing and have explored that in a variety of ways. And we're going to share a lot more about kind of how we came to this work specifically later on.
Yeah, so we feel really, and this will come up later, but it's really important to kind of name where you're coming from. Everyone has biases, and there's so much in the field of transformative justice that we still don't know, that we're learning. And so it's really important to name kind of where our practice came from and what it's looked like for us. So we want to share a bit more of our story. So it's interesting. I feel like we don't usually go as in depth in this, so I'm excited to share a bit more. We originally met in college, and we were doing a lot of work in general on campus, more as student leaders. We both were really involved in the leadership of a peer mentorship program for queer and trans students, and just like very involved students in general. But as we were working with folks across campus, realizing that a lot of the violence in our communities was being minimized and not managed by the administration, whether that was just not making it into logs. I know when I tried to file a report, I needed to go to counseling in order to move forward. There were just a lot of different obstacles to be able to get the harm that was happening on campus recognized. And at first, we approached it more as though this must be a mistake, and did a lot of the things through, the expected channels for change.
Mm-hmm. And I think this is common, feeling like, why don't people seek help, right? When we're thinking about queer and trans communities, communities of color, immigrant communities, why aren't people accessing the resources that they have? And then kind of thinking about in our own experiences, like, I know I didn't try to access resources because I didn't think that people would care or understand what had happened to me.
Yeah, and then when we were working with folks who had tried to use those resources, it became very clear that many of them were just not designed to meet our needs, and were very victim blaming. And that led to us becoming much more intensely doing direct action on campus. And you can see an image of that on the left. It culminated, we were two of the leaders of a movement on campus called Real Talk Dartmouth that started with one protest and then just really escalated from there. We were doing direct action every day for like 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
We started receiving a lot of threats and just hate speech online, and the administration wouldn't acknowledge it. So we printed it all out and started doing kind of going into the dean's offices, going into the president's offices with the hate speech and saying, you need to face this, even though it's online. This is what our everyday life is like. And it's interesting because the work that we were doing, we were having a lot of conflict with each other, especially as we started to receive more pressure from outside. And we often took on the role of trying to, manage conflict, mitigate things that were happening between us. And so at the time, we wouldn't have necessarily characterized what we were doing as transformative justice. We didn't have that language, but in reflection, it was very aligned with transformative justice. And I just love this tweet. I think this is Facebook, I think.
The beginning of the statement.
Yeah, the beginning of one of our first statements with Real Talk. Above all, we believe in accountability of individuals, institutions, and structures. And so we had some of the language at the time, but we're still building out what those practices look like and who else had been doing that work. And as that escalated, we ended up being the lead complainants on a federal complaint against our university, and getting connected with a lot of student organizers around the country who are doing similar things. And because we had dealt with a lot of internal conflict, particularly because we had started addressing a variety of different types of violence on campus, whether it was violence against, the Muslim community, Indigenous students, Black students, most of what was happening that were filing federal complaints was more around sexual violence. And so we started talking more actively about sexual violence because we knew that everyone in our communities were experiencing sexual violence, and that the folks who were not spoken about actually experienced it at higher rates. So queer and trans students, students of color, were experiencing higher rates of sexual violence. But that led to really intense conflicts in our organizing around whether or not sexual violence was a unifying frame for this sort of organizing, or whether it was like a white women's issue. And so that was something that we really wanted to focus on, was how can we build coalition that recognizes how we're not affected by sexual violence in the same ways, and that we might not see the state or the administration as a resource. And that's kind of what we decided to focus on. So in 2013, we left school and we started traveling around the country, living with student organizers at different universities and helping them.
Some professors,
Yeah. Helping them to learn from the mistakes that we had, lessons that we learned, and how they could build a more intentional coalition around sexual violence that centered the voices of students of color and queer and trans students.
Mm-hmm.
And that's more what you can see in this second photo. And part of what was interesting was in that we noticed two things. We noticed that a lot of people were focusing on activism and organizing in place of focusing on their healing, which caused us to really try to focus on our own healing and learn different healing modalities. The second thing, I guess there were three. The second thing was that people were experiencing a lot of conflict and harm within their organizing spaces. And that especially as activists and organizers, they didn't feel like the administration was a resource that they could turn to, and they needed to have some sort of protocol or infrastructure for managing that, which is what we started to kind of take on as a role when we were working with other people, because we weren't students at that school. And so we lived with them, we understood what they were doing, but we're kind of outside enough to be able to hold that space. And that's where we started holding more formal processes.
Yeah. Well, and I think just doing a lot of that online, I think that was what was unique about that moment in 2013, 2014, was that campus-based organizers were connecting all across the country and kind of creating this unifying narrative, right? Of it's not about a few bad apples, it's not about one bad case at one school, which is how the media had tended to cover it. And instead, this is about a narrative, this is about culture. And I do feel like the roots of kind of the Me Too movement were forming in that time, of people developing this coherent strategy, and then also having to share a lot personally to like elicit sympathy, have people feel like what mattered. And that was just a really disturbing time, I think. We were very young, and a lot of our close friends were, people who we had become close with during our organizing.
And both of us are survivors and had experienced sexual violence on college campuses as well, but didn't want to center that in the way that we were doing our work.
Right, but seeing headlines that were kind of lines that a friend's rapist had said to them in one of the most worst moments of their life was just really horrible. And that kind of culminated, there was this Law and Order SVU episode that was kind of this mishmash amalgamation of all of these campus sexual violence stories. And we watched that, and we had to stop, because we were just like, oh my God, they literally just took everyone's stories from news articles and just mishmashed them all together. And that really didn't feel very good. I think so that's why we wrote our book, Millennial Sex Education, which is a compilation of fictional stories. They're realistic. They showcase a lot of different types of couples, some, from high school age to, adult. And they're not perfect models, and they're also not terrible models. So that was good content to start working with. I think we started to realize that, consent education, prevention, I think a lot of people go down that route when they realize how pervasive this is. If we can just educate younger people, if we can just give people better models. And so that was really our vision with that. We started working with that in 2015 and have been, doing that sort of consent education work.
I think part of the challenge was, at the time, a lot of our peers were going into more legal advocacy and work in the criminal justice system, which we did not believe in. And so we thought that our intervention point was more in prevention, more in developing the tools that we didn't have to be able to address these things on our own. And so we didn't necessarily know the framing of thinking about it as transformative justice. I had read things like Color of Violence and was really in awe of the work that many of these incredible organizers had been doing, but didn't know exactly how much I could identify with that, how much what I was doing technically fit into that. Although now I feel really strongly that the work that we were doing also was a different type of transformative justice. And so we decided to focus more on culture, on stories, and on tools. And we got a lot of opportunities at that point because we were partnering with all of these other student organizers as well, like the opportunity to be on stage with Lady Gaga at the Oscars in 2016. It was a mixed experience because we first got to meet all of these organizers that we had been working with online, some of them for the first time in person, which was, for me, really the highlight. I think at the same time it was interesting because it was the year of Oscars So White, and I remember feeling this internal kind of tension between race and gender and sexual violence and my abolitionist and racial organizing, but ultimately felt that it was more important to participate and to have people see someone like me on the stage in that message than to maintain this idea that it's only cis white girls who experience this problem. So those were some of the things that we were able to do, and we started to focus more and more on healing. We became certified Reiki practitioners. We started doing somatics, herbalism, and just different things that were less reliant on the medical system and on the criminal system. This is an example of a healing meetup that we held, and we were doing those regularly. And then
yeah, and I think that was kind of aligned with this, like starting to change our beliefs around, like, it's not that, there's a set number of perpetrators that need to be stopped. It's that almost all of us are in these cycles of kind of experiencing harm, perpetrating harm, learning, you know, just going through these cycles. And that everyone has a lot of healing and personal work to do, especially around like early life trauma.
And I think we knew that from the beginning. There were parts of me that identified more as working with survivors, but even the federal complaint that we put in against our university, the other main lead complainant with us was someone who had experienced hazing in the fraternities and gender-based violence within the fraternities, but who had also been kind of pledge master himself and kind of had realized the violence that he had committed. And so I think from the beginning, we realized that survivors could also commit harm and that people who committed harm could also be survivors, and that it was important to know how to work on all of those things at the same time.
So then in 2016, the book We Believe You came out. We contributed, you know, quite a bit to that. And it was really nice compared to some other media or narrative projects that people had done, because each of the survivors had complete editorial control, which is so important in like having autonomy around how your story is put out there. And then also, yeah, we were able to participate in events around that. And that was another opportunity to meet some really amazing survivors from around the country, some of whom we're still very close friends with. So We Believe You.
Survivors of campus sexual assault speak out.
Yeah. And if people do feel like I really need to like understand this issue, it's, you know, came out a couple of years ago now, but if people are like, I don't get it, or like, I want to understand how, you know, campus culture relates to this or what the survivor experience is like, I would recommend that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit more of our background when we were working primarily on sexual violence. And I'll say that at that point, the campus sexual violence movement started getting a lot more influence over politics and media. And it was really challenging for us because a lot of the things that were seen as solutions by politicians coming out of this movement were very carceral and punitive.
Yeah, so there started to be, you know, people, I think it was Republican-led, a bill to say that you needed to file, I think, a police report in order to access survivor services, right? And a lot of people were organizing against that. And then there was conversation around mandatory minimums around Brock Turner, right? Like how can this guy get away with this? We need to have higher mandatory minimums. And that echoes earlier conversations, right?
And the truth is, the more we spoke out about the fact that we didn't believe that and didn't believe in, you know, that approach, or that didn't work for us and people that we worked with, the more it felt like we were invited to things, but our voice was erased. So we were included in photos, but things that we were saying weren't being included. Or, you know, people would be like, wow, that's really interesting, but then kind of rewrite it as though, you know, it fit into their narrative and didn't necessarily reference the work that we had done. And I think some examples that are really clear, even in the hunting ground, the majority of our interview was about who's actually impacted by sexual violence and why the reporting mechanisms don't work for us. But at the same time, they asked me to share more about my story. And at first I didn't feel comfortable with that, but I was like, okay, my story, you know, illustrates this because I was assaulted by a woman. And they cut everything else except for the story about my assault and made it gender unspecific so that it seemed like I was assaulted by a frat brother.
Right.
And
actually, in how it was edited, it seemed like they were implying that you had been assaulted by our co-complainant on our federal complaint. Yeah.
And so like, those are just some examples of how like people get kind of boiled down to their experience of sexual violence. And then especially for folks who are, you know, people of color, queer and trans folks, abolitionists, our analysis gets cut out of it. And as that continued to happen, we decided to pivot our focus towards more local work. One of the major things that impacted us was we were in Miami at the time, which is where I'm from, and found that yeah, the film is by Kirby Dick, but I think it's a broader issue with the way that a lot of documentaries are run. So for example, that documentary was in partnership with CNN and was funded by the Weinstein Company, which is interesting. So I think that it's a broader issue, but yeah. And that was someone in the chat asked that.
Right, and I know that CNN and the Weinstein Company did exert, you know, some editorial influence. Yeah.
Right. So I don't know exactly what happened on the back end, but I think that's important to keep in mind. So what happened though is that after the election, we had been, you know, traveling, we had been working with students, and we were in Miami, and just immediately saw the impact that it had on our communities locally in Miami, particularly queer and trans folks, people of color, and immigrants, just feeling like this was going to have major repercussions. And I particularly had this feeling that I had invested so much in elite universities, to be frank, and peers around the country, that I hadn't invested the same amount of focus in my own hometown. And so we decided to pivot our work to center local work, particularly with abolitionist organizations, queer and trans groups, immigrant groups, and think really about the ways that our movement in the sexual violence movement were contributing to some of the violence that other people in our space were feeling, and realizing that a lot of folks had really aligned values, believed in a lot of the same things, but didn't necessarily have the protocols, infrastructure, resources to design responses that weren't dependent on the state. And so we got really involved locally. Some examples of that are, we were finally trained in circle keeping formally, and we started doing circles in a more formal way. This is on the right, a circle that we held around safety planning at a trans conference in South Florida. I was the lead of a non-binary youth leadership program for youth organizers of color, and we did a performance art piece about the future of gender, which is up here, and we held community conversations around understanding your gender beyond the binary. And then we were the first statewide transformative justice coordinators for the Dream Defenders in South Florida, which Cindy's in the chat. Cindy's the new TJ lead for Dream Defenders, and this is actually a photo from when Miriam came down to do a training with us in 2018. And so those are some examples. We have more on the next slide, but we just wanted to share a little bit more of how our focus pivoted. We were still supporting folks at universities more remotely, but we wanted to really invest our time and energy locally.
And I think that so often when survivors or advocates or people who are interested in this theoretically come to us, it seems like this transformative justice feels like such a big idea, right? It's like, do I need to get a master's degree in that or something? And I think we one of the reasons why we shared a lot of these examples is I do believe that each of these is kind of a facet of ways in which we were attempting to address and shift the root conditions of violence, and then also provide resources and support for people who, had experienced or perpetuated harm. And all of that is what gave us our foundation for being able to do this work. And, maybe some of you can relate to some of these experiences.
Yeah, and there was a question about learning the circle process. I mean, I'll just say that I realized by getting trained in circle keeping that we had already done a lot of our meetings in circle, just didn't have the formal process or know, formally how to set up the altar and things like that. And so I think it gave structure to things that felt intuitive to us. And we definitely integrate circle more, I would say, in the way that we hold meetings and communicate with each other. We do integrate circles into our TJ processes, but they're not primarily circles. I would say we do a lot more conferencing, a lot more community education, journaling, things like that. And then often that will include certain circles, especially with support groups, and may culminate, I was trained to do the more restorative community conferencing based in the New Zealand approach. And so we can incorporate that as kind of a big component of the process, but I would say that that's not the primary piece of the process. It's just a tool that's integrated depending on what makes sense for the process that we're holding.
Yeah, and we were trained in the impact justice model.
Yeah. So then we wanted to, again, just share a variety of examples of what this work has looked like for us. And I think I really like to mention that the first time that I learned some of these frameworks was actually in 6th grade. I went to a Catholic school for most of my life, which is a mixed bag, but as a retreat leader, I was trained in a lot of ways of knowing how to mediate and manage conflict between my peers. And I was not Catholic, and that meant that as a retreat leader, I wasn't able to lead sessions, which again, I have mixed feelings about. But as a result of not being able to lead sessions, that often meant that I was the identified support person for the space. And so starting in 6th grade, I started getting a lot of just reports of harm that people had experienced from their peers, from their family, some of which they didn't feel comfortable with me sharing with the school or the teachers. And because we were, in school for the rest of the year, I found myself continuing to do work with folks even outside of the retreats to try to manage harm and conflict that they were experiencing either in school or at home. I didn't feel totally prepared to do that. I mean, I don't know how old you are in 6th grade. You're like 12 or something. But I will say that had a big impact on the way that I thought about harm, the way that I thought about my peers needing to hold confidentiality, and the value and importance of peer education specifically, because I don't think they would have opened up to the adults in the space, which is why we're really focused on training peers.
Yeah, and I think that I both experienced a lot of the, support that can be held in faith spaces, and then really saw a lot of lack of accountability in my church community growing up around queer and trans exclusion, and them making the decision to leave the denomination over accepting queer and trans people, which was very harmful to me as a queer teenager in that space, which caused me to seek out Quaker and Unitarian Universalist spaces that I think do a lot of just like practices to try to cultivate peace. So Quaker meetings are held in a decentralized way. In Unitarian Universalism, you can, come to it with your own belief system. And then it was very interesting. I was an intern in this basically commune, intentional living community in New York City for a summer, and that had been around since the 70s, just kind of like, old school hippie stuff. And they were so passionate about collective decision making that they held circles every single morning. So you could go to a breakfast circle and just kind of be heard and speak and talk about a variety of issues. So that was when I first started to experience circle and to experience some of these philosophies in practice.
So we just wanted to name that was even before we were doing our student organizing separately. And then we already mentioned some of our, more formal student groups. And then I wanted to name a class that I took that was really impactful to me, which was a popular education or participatory action research style class that was in partnership with folks at the local jail. And we co-designed a play together, and it was really about following their lead and understanding their experience. That was really transformative for me. And my research focus for the semester was on trans folks who were incarcerated. And that was really the moment I think that I started to identify as an abolitionist, because I think that before then I had really been socialized to believe that it could work in some capacity. And working with folks face to face, seeing what their experience was. And also I was a pen pal with a trans woman who was incarcerated, hearing her experience, meeting with her mom. There was no way, and I think this is what's linked to the conference title for NISCASA, which is there was no way that I was going to participate in solving violence with violence. And that was really transformative for me.
Yeah. And then also I think, I went and saw that play and
we were already dating.
Heard you processing that. And a lot of it was like the behaviors that the people in the community were incarcerated for were the same things students are doing, right? And so it's this like kind of perverse dynamic of relatively privileged college students coming in and being like, yeah, I do that, and you just got caught for it. And so just kind of like distancing this idea of like people do terrible things and that's why they're in jail.
I think that's also part of why it's so important that students are working with the folks in the community, not just on their campus, because I think a lot of campuses have amnesty policies and just have a lot of privilege that folks in the community don't have. And I think that's one of the things we're really excited. I know Miriam mentioned them. We're working with the folks at Brown, and we're going to be doing a 2-day training on transformative justice with them next month. And it's actually inviting and involving folks who are community organizers outside of the school. And I think that's really important to do.
Yes. We had a question pop up, if I could ask it, just to clarify what you mean by abolitionist in this context.
Yes, that's a great question. So I would say that there's a piece by Critical Resistance that has been really, really helpful for me in thinking about the aspects of abolition. And so I would say in general, abolition means that I don't think that the current system of incarceration and punishment is appropriate to respond to violence. And so I believe in the abolition of the current infrastructure of police and prisons. I still think there needs to be an ethical response to violence. I just don't think that it needs to be structured the way that it currently is. And what abolition looks like in practice, there's three components that I really appreciate that Critical Resistance articulated, which is excarceration, decarceration, and moratorium. So excarceration is getting people out of prison.
So that's like clemency,
bail.
Right.
Decarceration is preventing people from going into prison in the first place. And so that might be like restorative justice diversion, managing cases in community. And then moratorium is preventing prisons from being built in the first place, because they're constantly building new prisons and they're going to find people to put in it. And I think a big piece there is that I do think that there are other infrastructures that can be put in place. I think that restorative justice specifically is very scalable. And I think that part of the reason why I don't say that transformative justice is an alternative to police and prisons is because I think police and prisons are getting involved in a lot of things that just don't need the kind of response that are in place. So it's not that transformative justice would respond to all of the types of cases that police and prisons are responding to, because there's a variety of things that I don't think need to be responded to in that way. I think we need a new infrastructure, a different framework for responding to violence and harm in our communities. And that means part of that is the abolition of the current system.
Right. And I like to say that, every other, like the United States at this moment in time has like the world's highest percentage of incarcerated people, which means that this current society is relying on that mechanism more than any other society throughout any other point in history. So there's lots of other models or strategies that people use to deal with this.
I think was there another question in the Q&A? I think we can't quite see those.
Yeah, we had somebody just asked a question. They hear restorative justice and transformative justice used interchangeably-ish.
What's the difference?
What is the difference?
Yeah, and this is something that often we have longer trainings on, and so, we'll give a briefer response. I think that the challenge here is that there are lots of restorative justice practitioners who are approaching their work in a transformative way, and there are lots of transformative justice practitioners who are integrating practices from restorative justice. And so I don't think it's as clear of a divide as the titles would suggest. But the way that we think about it is that restorative justice, how do you want to?
Yeah, restorative justice, I would say just very briefly, in the context of campus sexual misconduct, would be more responding to individual cases in a restorative way. And there's a lot of stuff that you can look up about that.
And that would be through the administration particularly.
Right. Yeah. And so it's often like a tweak or replacement or supplement to the campus disciplinary system. It's, more institutionalized, and it's a more formal process.
I will say there are some folks doing really, really cool restorative justice work on college campuses that are more around building understanding circles, getting to know each other, that are more about culture building, not around discipline. And I would say that's more of a transformative way of using restorative justice practices.
Yeah, and I think generally transformative justice to me is about shifting conditions. Shifting the condition. Yeah, Skidmore's done a lot of research into this through the PRISM program. PRISM, not prison, yeah. And transformative justice, just as a broad thing for me, is about culture and shifting the conditions and norms. And so you can do that in an individual case of responding to harm, but it's less about the circle and more about like, why did this happen? And doing a lot of healing work often with the survivor perpetuator. And I think transformative justice can be done in literally so many ways. So don't like quote me on that as how you do transformative justice. And we'll talk a lot more about this during our programming during the this CASA conference in June.
Yes,
so
we'll have a lot more about this in the conference in June. And I would say that for me, transformative justice is more of an umbrella term that includes like accountability processes as well as transformative justice organizing. And that restorative justice is a like methodology for responding to instances of harm between people or communities. And so those are kind of the main differences to me. But we draw on both of those.
Yeah. All right, let's keep moving.
Great. So we already talked a little bit more about our TJ organizing, about managing conflict within activist coalitions and organizing communities. When we founded our organization in 2013 and we started working with student organizers nationally, working on healing, working across difference, managing conflict and harm, especially abusive relationships, organizing strategy and narrative for organizers. Then once we pivoted to South Florida, there are a few other types of things that we were doing. So I was the coordinator for restorative justice-based program, leadership program for trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming youth of color with Soul Sisters Leadership Coalition. Then we were the two first transformative justice coordinators statewide for Dream Defenders. That involved kind of designing their program and like infrastructure, as well as managing a variety of cases that were particularly gender-based violence cases, facilitating the accountability processes themselves. Then I, through Soul Sisters, co-facilitated the first felony juvenile restorative justice diversion case in Miami-Dade County. And as they're building out that restorative justice diversion program, we supported them in designing, kind of implementing transformative justice practices into that restorative justice diversion program structure. And
then we were both part of a restoration team at a very large United We Dream conference, which was about having capacity at a conference for directly impacted young organizers to address conflict and challenges as they arose without wanting to involve police, because pretty much everyone there was undocumented.
And then we also supported a more informal collective that was trying to build community accountability processes to address gender-based violence in the Miami underground music scene. That's something that's still in development. We help them more with designing their values and initial kind of design for the program. And then all of this really culminated in Miami in our 4 to 6 month Transformative Justice and Consent Fellowship for youth organizers in South Florida. And we have Cindy, who's actually in the chat, who is one of our fellows and is now the Transformative Justice Coordinator statewide for the Dream Defenders. That was really around supporting folks in understanding how to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. And we had the intention of moving. We now live in Denver, and we really wanted to externalize and transfer the knowledge that we had and the information that we had developed to local folks who are going to continue the work. And we continue to support them, and they can reach out to us with any questions, and are just really, really excited and proud of the work that they're doing. And the other thing that we do is we support nonprofits and movement organizations in implementing transformative justice and restorative justice practices around building more healthy and equitable cultures and designing infrastructure for responding to conflict and harm in the organization, or creating more generative conflict in the organization.
Yeah, and one caveat, that's not going to work in all organizations. It does need to be an organization that is somewhat equitable, at least striving for equal participation in the space.
Values driven.
Right. But we're going to have a whole workshop about that at the conference. So if you are interested in that, which could include campus practices,
definitely
come to that workshop.
Yeah, I would definitely say if you're curious about campus practices, come to the implementing RJ, TJ in your organization session, which is it's like a 5-hour session. There's a lot of details.
Yeah. And so, this is a lot, but I think that with the interests and kind of path that we've developed, these are opportunities that we recognized as just ways to build our skill in these practices. I think many of these later ones are more formal ways of implementing this in ways that we had been doing more informally earlier on.
Yeah, so that kind of all comes into who is Spring Up. This is a photo of some of our fellows from our fellowship that we were just talking about. But we do consent, gender, and power education. We facilitate and train around transformative justice for gender-based violence. We do diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting and coaching for organizations and individuals. We hold healing spaces and try to integrate disability justice into everything that we do, including our training. We practice popular education and participatory action research. We're very focused on evaluation and growth. And we're storytellers and fiction writers. And so that's just kind of what we do at Spring Up. It can be hard to describe for people who don't kind of understand these topics, but hopefully hearing more about our story, you can see what this work means to us.
Mm-hmm. And so our mission is cultivating a culture of consent and liberty for all. And that's kind of the through line in all of these topics.
So then we're a bit behind schedule, so I want to keep things moving quickly, but we wanted to talk a little bit more about what references we're making in our work. And Miriam and Sujatha and Mimi and a lot of the folks that you all have been hearing from are some of the folks that we look up to, learn from, whether it's their resources or them individually. And so Mia Mingus from the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective said this, and I think that it's a really good articulation of some of what we've been talking about. It's important to remember that many of these people and communities have been practicing TJ in big and small ways for generations, trying to create safety and reduce harm within the dangerous conditions they were and are forced to live in. For example, undocumented immigrant women in domestic violence relationships, disabled people who are being abused by their caretakers and attendants, sex workers who experience sexual assault or abuse, or poor children and youth of color who are surviving child sexual abuse have long been devising ways to reduce harm, stay alive, and create safety and healing outside of state systems, whether or not these practices have been explicitly named as transformative justice.
Mm-hmm.
I see we missed a question.
Yeah, and so if any of you would like to volunteer in the chat ways that you believe that you've been cultivating your roots of transformative justice or doing things to alleviate conditions of harm, definitely would love to hear about that. And do you have time? Should we check?
Yeah, it depends on what the topic is.
Yeah.
Chelsea, can you tell us what the question is?
Yeah, so it's less of a question and more of a comment, so we could address it very quickly, and I feel comfortable doing so. So the comment is more of abolitionism to the speaker, who is a white woman, resonates as a cause related to the end of slavery and the campaign to gain the right to vote. And it didn't occur to them that we were referring to issues of mass incarceration. The reason that we're using that language is it's intentional. It's using the same language as anti-slavery or slavery abolition. So yeah, those are deeply connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the idea that the current prison system is the continuation of enslavement, and that's specifically when you think about the 13th Amendment, and that within the abolition of slavery, it says that no people will be enslaved other than people who have committed a crime. And that means that literally the abolition of slavery had a caveat, which was that you can continue to behave in ways that would be categorized as slavery if you're talking about people who are incarcerated. And that's why it's the continuation of that practice and movement of abolition to take it to its ultimate conclusion.
Mm-hmm. And that's a, continuation of a race-based caste system, both in how especially Black people are targeted for offenses that everyone commits, but are overpunished for those because of surveillance. And then also the fact that people in prisons are working for pennies to, participate in the economic system and without being compensated for that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm glad you highlighted that because it is intentionally the same language. So continuing in this, if anyone wants to put in the comments any ways that you see yourself identifying roots of transformative justice in your work, we're going to share some of the lineages that have impacted us, and we'll do this a bit quicker because I think we've already mentioned many of these. So particularly women of color organizers, transformative justice, and community accountability practitioners, most of whom that we've learned from for a longer period of time have been women of color, as well as family and cultural practices that just didn't rely on the state. So even my family in Italy, my family in the States, there have always been ways that we've managed harm without calling someone else. as well as there are a lot of formal resources like anthologies, toolkits, zines, webinars, videos like this. And I think some important shout outs are Miriam's most recent release of Fumbling Towards Repair, Creative Interventions Toolkit that Mimi made is incredible. We're really excited about this new book by Lea Roth, Beyond Survival. There's just so many amazing, amazing tools out there. The revolution starts at home. Another route for us is particularly queer and trans folks. I'll say that's like the thing that I've experienced the most in my life is resource sharing strategies, community-based services and care, collective action and self-advocacy, particularly work that sex workers have done to design support systems for each other, and spaces of liberatory joy and play. There's also some really, really cool things being done, including with Pussy Palace in London, about designing safe spaces that are about play and joy and partying.
Mm-hmm. And then we always mention ACT UP and the HIV/AIDS crisis as being I believe, really powerful example of transformative justice, of people like literally being killed and coming together to organize to really shift the conditions, get the medicine they needed, get destigmatized, and get health resources while supporting each other.
We will have a really extensive book list at the conference in June.
Yeah, and then perhaps Chelsea, you could take some notes on books we're mentioning. I think you probably know most of these, and then we could share that with folks after the fact.
Yeah,
I am already. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And then Indigenous communities, there, again, like Lee said, we are relying on prisons in a way that is unprecedented. And so literally every culture in the world has other practices that are not this that we can draw on. And that includes Indigenous folks in the United States. I think it's really important to shout out the work of the Diné community or the Navajo community, especially Justice Yazzie. And there's just even the circle keeping practice that we learned through like Cape Pranis was developed in partnership with the Yukon folks and First Nation in Canada. So there's just so much there. There's also just especially frameworks for responding to large-scale state violence, like the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa or the grass courts in Rwanda, which we lived in Rwanda for a while, and that's a big reference for us. We talked about intentional communities, including faith-based communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you know, whenever you're creating an organization or especially a living community that is that is intentionally having different norms than are expected in mainstream society, you need to really be intentional and mindful about the agreements you're having, the vision of the community, what standards of behavior, how are you going to address things in the community, and that draws on a lot, including you know, thousands of years of monasteries and faith-based communities. There's this really, really theoretical, technical book called Tools for Peace that was really influential to us earlier on. It's by a monk in the order of Saint Benedict, and he just was reflecting on living in a monastery, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, so that's another reference. Restorative justice, as we've mentioned, peacekeeping circles, the RCC model from New Zealand, as well as I love the three-tiered model that RJoy, Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, designed for school implementation. And we'll talk about that a lot more in our session about how organizations can implement restorative justice.
Mm-hmm.
But you can look that up. There's a bunch about it online. And then abolitionist organizing and harm reduction around the prison industrial complex. So there's so much around that. You know, I've been involved with Southerners on New Ground, and there's just a lot of different, the Sylvia Rivera Project has some really great resources. Just how can we support folks who have been impacted by the violence of this system as we're doing this work?
Yeah, and then, you know, a decent number of the tools and frameworks that we use or draw on actually do come from sociology, psychology, mindfulness, and we list all of these because often, especially white folks who are wanting to do work like this, have this immediate concern of like, I'm appropriating, I'm taking indigenous practices, this is not ethical. And, you know, definitely listen to those instincts, right? I think if you are co-opting people's practices in a way that doesn't feel authentic to you, listen to that, right? But there are so many ways of addressing harm and violence that might feel more authentic to you, that you can draw on. And so I know we're like just dropping a lot of references, but any of these things are joy. You know, you can Google, you can look up, and there are so many resources that that you can educate yourself further in.
And luckily, because this is recorded, you can always come back. I know we speak quickly, but you can pause between when we name the different things, or maybe Chelsea will be able to type it up, but we don't have a ton of time, so we're just trying to throw as many out there as feel relevant. So then we just wanted to share a little bit more about how we choose what we work on. So we particularly focus on transformative justice organizing. So it means using storytelling, popular education, organizing, as well as designing alternatives and solutions to cultivate cultural norms that are more conducive to transformative justice, restorative justice, community accountability, and gender equity. While we do manage some cases, which I'll talk about a little bit lower, a lot of our work now is more around education, storytelling, and just shifting those foundational norms so that we have less cases to manage, and that we can coach and support other folks who are facilitating cases, while we can focus on things that have really large scale impacts. So like I said, we also facilitate cases and offer support or coaching to other facilitators. A big focus for that is kind of the difference between crime and harm.
Right. And I think this is important to say when we're saying strategies that don't involve the police. People are like, somebody's going to kill someone and you're not going to call the police. You know, I think it's really important that a lot of harm, especially gender-based violence and sexual harm, we know that the criminal legal system does not respond well at all to gender-based violence, especially, you know, domestic violence, especially in queer and trans contexts.
Right. So much is not reported, and if it is reported, it's often mismanaged.
Yeah, and you can see cases that are like seem very strong that don't meet certain levels of proof, and so sometimes people file civil cases instead of criminal cases. That's one way that people who don't meet some of those burdens try to access resources, but also a lot of people just wish that people cared what happened to them and were willing to support them. And there are a lot of community-based things that we can do to shift the norms around abusive relationships, around intimate partner violence, and especially around like incidences of sexual harm.
So I think there are two pieces here. One is that when you're thinking about a crime, the reason why it's, you know, the state versus this person is because the thing that's being responded to is not the fact that you harmed another person. It's the fact that you broke a law. So you harmed the state, and that's what's being responded to. So instead of focusing on breaking the law or breaking rules or violence against the state, our focus is on harm that's occurred. And that would be why survivors aren't as central to the process of the criminal legal system, because it's not actually about the fact that they were harmed. It's about the fact that a law was broken. And so by centering harm and centering the experience of survivors, that's one of the major ways that we are different from the way that the legal system operates.
Right.
The second thing is that we focus on bridging the gap in response. So most sexual and gender-based violence does not make it through formal processes or meet legal definitions and standards, but is still harmful. That is what we get involved in. And so there are different types of practitioners who get involved in different things. We don't actually involve ourselves in any case that has any touch point with the state. There are ways that we've been brought in by restorative justice programs to support and facilitation of a diverted case. That's a different thing. But the majority of what we do as an organization is things that don't involve the police at all, and usually cases that no one would involve the police, either because they just really don't believe it or because it's not technically illegal, it's just harmful. And so even our documentation and things couldn't be used in a legal case because it's not technically illegal. So when we are managing those cases, what are we doing? It's really important to be aware of the cultural, societal, and historical power dynamics at play. So we try to work with communities that we identify with, that we know, and then we do as much as we can to try to understand the history of that family, that community, what kind of violence has happened in the past, and how might that be impacting the dynamics here? What are the values and cultural norms in this community? And then we try to meet the needs of survivors, provide perpetuators with, and I say that intentionally because everyone perpetuates systems of violence. So it's not that someone, it's like they're a perpetrator. It's just every one of us has been a perpetuator, but that's the role that they're playing. Perpetuators with opportunities to understand the impacts of their actions and make amends, and support communities in learning from the harm and making future harm less likely to occur. So when we are managing cases, that's what it is that we're doing.
Yeah.
Okay, so now the next bit of this, so we're significantly behind time, so we might go a bit quickly on this, and you can definitely screenshot if you want to. But so we break down kind of the way that we set the expectations for the space, that there are values, which are ideals we strive towards, but that it's kind of hard to make tangible or know exactly you're not being, liberatory in the space. I'm not sure what that means. And then community agreements are formal practices or, things that we can literally do that we can hold ourselves accountable to. So it can be clear cut, are you or aren't you doing this? And we have that divide because values are really, really important and shape the space, but they're also very much up for interpretation and don't always become operationalized. And so the agreements are ways that we operationalize that. And when we hold a process, we share these with folks, and then they have the ability to identify which ones really relate to them and their work, as well as add other ones that will guide the entire process that we work on with them.
Yeah, and just what are we emphasizing in this presentation are two really huge pillars of transformative justice, which is storytelling and kind of locating the personal, and then also values. Like those are just really huge cornerstones of transformative justice.
So we're just going to dig in.
Yeah, and I think
oh, thanks. Yes. Sorry that you all have to leave, but you can definitely listen later.
Yeah. So shall we read all of these, or I think maybe with time, perhaps we should just read the titles
and kind of explain it a little bit.
Yeah, and you can see at least the definitions are this way, because if I say transformation, you might have a totally different interpretation of what that means, or the way in which I'm practicing transformation in my personal practices might be really different from an organization trying to transform their processes. And so having a definition that at least you can say, I don't agree with that sentence, or I think we should add something, is really important to us to make the values explicit.
Yeah, so for transformation, one thing I want to say is that transformation is more than intention. It's strategy, planning, time, study, self-reflection, a support system, and tools to implement new habits and beliefs. So I think that's really important. It takes time to transform. And then the two practices that we have are storytelling. We've talked a lot about that, and we hold a lot of spaces for storytelling, fictional and nonfiction.
Yeah, and I do want to emphasize the one word where we say transformations catalyzed by storytelling are consensual, right? Like if I tell a story that causes you to have personal reflections, you are totally in control of what lessons you take from that and how you implement that in your life. I'm not telling you, I told you this story and so now you need to do this, although I might have a request or a call to action, right? But I think that that's very important when we're thinking about behavioral change. Yeah.
And then reflection and evaluation is so important. You have to have a culture of evaluation, not like one person on the team that does it. It's really for us, it's a lifestyle of constantly iterating and growing and responding to feedback. And so you need to have time and thought and intention towards having space for reflection and evaluation. The next value that we have is healing, and really important, healing is a process, not a destination. And it can't be bounded. So that's not like the outcome of a process, but it is something that's important to us. And yeah, we talk a little bit more about the fact that in some spaces, there's more of an emphasis on being able to identify kind of the ways that you've been harmed and less of an emphasis on how you're healing and working through your traumas. And that's really, really important, especially for facilitators as we're doing this work. And then the two practices or agreements are care for yourself and your people. I first heard that from Miriam at one of her trainings, Miriam Kaba. And just, we don't enter spaces on our own. We always have people that we care for or who care for us. And as much as we want to cultivate presence, we also want to take care of ourselves and the people that come with us. And also, I really want to shout out the book Care Work.
Yeah, I don't think we have a copy of that right now,
but it's by Lea Lakshmi Pienza.
Samarasina?
Yes, thank you. I have a bit of a hard time saying her name, but it's a really, really, really powerful book of anthology all about the nature of care work. And she calls for a fair trade care economy where care is consensual, reciprocal, equitably distributed, and appropriately valued.
Yeah.
And then accept incompletion, just like healing takes time and is not bounded and doesn't become complete. Most of our processes don't. Most of our meetings don't. And especially if we're going to embrace emergent strategy, we need to be okay with not getting through everything that we necessarily planned on. And this idea of urgency and completion is really core to capitalism.
And providing services.
And providing services, yes. True, and meeting reporting requirements. So it's all about finding a sense of balance and trying to find a way to be present, still get things done, but not be so focused on completion and urgency. Okay, the next value is solidarity. So people are experts in their own reality, so we work with directly impacted folks, and we also really partner with other organizations and people who have shared values. There's a lot of siloing and competition, and we feel really, really strongly that we need to work together and collaborate and support each other's work in order to do this effectively. And so the practices that go along with that are subjectivity and specificity. We're always telling folks not to generalize, use I statements, and try to share specific examples of things that you're talking about instead of saying, you know, people always do this, or, you know, people feel this way. Try to share a specific example, and that really helps us kind of communicate across difference and locate where these opinions are coming from. The other one is shared labor. These are long and messy processes, and often there are certain people who are expected to do more of the weight of labor, and that's often femme folks, queer and trans folks, people of color. And so a way that we operationalize this,
survivors themselves,
yes.
often because the survivor is really invested. It's definitely not good when a survivor ends up doing like a disproportionate amount of the work. Survivor-centered is not the same as survivor-led. And we're going to be talking a lot more about the roles in processes. How many people can have roles in supporting a process, right, at the conference in the session on facilitating a process that will involve a role play too. So if you want like tangibly like how do I do that, try to come to that session if you're able to come to the conference.
And we keep really detailed timesheets. I was really irritated by this at the beginning because I thought of it as like a manager thing to like make sure you're getting your work done, but it's really part of that evaluation reflection piece. When you can actually tell who's doing what labor, how long it takes them, that can help you be much more thoughtful about how you're evaluating the distribution of labor. So instead of making it about micromanagement, it can really be about evaluation and equity and fairness in the distribution of labor.
Right.
Okay, the next value that we have is sustainability. Accountability and transformation is not about quick fixes and easy solutions, and that means these things take time. And we need to have strategies that center long-term sustainable changes that maintain after the intervention is over and that impact people broader than those directly involved in the process. And that can be challenging, but that's, I think, what makes it transformative as opposed to some of these other approaches. And part of that is also finding a sense of balance where as facilitators, as organizations, we want to do everything under the sun, and we need to find a way to sustain ourselves, take care of ourselves, and meet our needs, whether that's figuring out ways to fund this work, having boundaries around what kinds of cases you take, accepting that things will take a long time to manage. It's really important that we don't burn ourselves out because there's such an overwhelming amount of work to be done.
Yeah, and I think that's especially important in, if you're managing a state diverted restorative justice case, like you want to close it, like there's a pressure to be like, okay, how many cases are we doing? Let's keep it moving. Let's just reach a good enough point of resolution and move on. Whereas transformative justice cases, because they're so involved in shifting the conditions and tend to be more community-based and unbounded, can literally take years, and it takes a lot of patience and just persistence, but in cycles. And yeah, it might take a long time to see a change in someone's behavior, but it's absolutely possible.
And so what are the practices associated with this? Depth without drowning, which is something we first heard in Novo spaces, which is that while we want to go deep in our conversations, we also need to kind of self-regulate around not going so deep that we can't come back, we can't continue with the work. And that part of, when I say that, it kind of implies that you're expected to do that work on your own. I think it has to be done in partnership with creating spaces that are intentionally for deep reflection, analysis, and cathartic feeling in community, and not you know, expecting people to do that on their own time. So I think it's a both and situation. And then the other one is Emergent Strategy. Shout out to Adrienne Marie Brown. What a transformative book for all of us. But being flexible, being creative, adapting to the needs of the situation actually make you more effective and more sustainable. I noticed we missed something in the questions. Novo is, oh man, what is it?
What does it stand for?
What does it stand for? It's a foundation. Particularly, I know their Move to End Violence fellowship, but they have a bunch of different fellowships. I'm not sure exactly what it stands for.
I think they mostly focus on gender-based violence. I think it's in California. I don't know. They have some great trainings on racial equity
and gender.
Yeah. I wanted to make a note, if folks have questions, if you could send those to all panelists, then we can see that as well. And so we can kind of decide if we want to address that as we're moving or save that for a Q&A at the end. Chelsea, is there anything from the current questions that seems urgent?
Nothing that seems urgent. We'll save it for the Q&A.
We'll circle back.
We'll circle back to that in the Q&A.
Great. So the next one, this one's really close to my heart, is about being non-binary. And that's not just about gender, it's about a way of life, a way of looking at things that kind of deconstruct assumptions and binary thinking to embrace nuance, intersectionality, context, and uniqueness. And we will have a whole long session on this at the conference, which is really about rethinking our framing of gender-based violence beyond the binary. We have just a ton of thoughts about this, but we wanted to share one tool which I think is featured in the Beyond Survival anthology and that we love. There's an Instagram called @Vent Diagrams, and it's all about identifying kind of the tensions of things that are both true and moving through the middle. You don't actually write anything in the middle, but it's about finding that you are in the middle. You're the thing that balances these two sides. So an example of this is there's a Venn diagram that on one side says, I expect people to respect my boundaries and needs, and on the other side, I want to be flexible and adapt to what people are able to do. And so it's not that one of those is more true than the other, it's that we want to hold both of those at the same time when we're figuring out our behavior. And so the practices that go along with that, one of those is something that I've already been saying, we say it all the time, which is both and, which is literally instead of either or true false dichotomies, thinking about how multiple truths can be true at the same time. And then the other one is take it or leave it. And this is something that Miriam is always saying, which is there's no right or wrong way of healing or doing this transformative work. Some may be more effective than others, depending on the situation and the person. And so even from everything that we've been saying today, take what works for you, take what you want to try, and whatever you don't resonate with, you can leave it. That's totally fine. It's really up to you, your consent of what you want to implement. We're not trying to force any of these practices on you.
Mm-hmm. And there really are, and I don't think, should be, really standardized practices around a lot of this work. A lot of it is based in your intuition, your understanding and perception of the situation, your self-trust. And I think that can induce a lot of anxiety for people of, am I doing the right thing? But that's why it's so important to do a lot of your personal work and reflection and mindfulness to be able to trust yourself, or at least have people that you can talk to. Yeah.
And it's really important to put in the study, right? Which is like, you can tell throughout everything we've been doing, we're constantly reading books, we're constantly learning from different practitioners. That doesn't mean we're going to replicate exactly what they did, but it really is about study and learning in addition to your intuition and what you know. And it's a complicated thing to really articulate, but I think that it's really both of those things. And then finally, our last value is liberation. We genuinely believe that everyone can be and deserves to be free. That's very difficult because people have different needs and desires, and knowing how to navigate different people's beliefs can be really challenging. And that's where these two practices that I would say are the bread and butter. I feel like I don't even eat bread and butter that much. I don't know. The vegetables and oil, I don't know, of our work. One of those is accountability. I really love Connie Burke in the essay Think, Rethink from The Revolution Starts at Home, talks about how accountability is an internal skill. And often we talk about holding other people accountable instead of learning the skill of knowing how to hold ourselves accountable. And that's really, really important.
I think that might actually be from trauma stewardship, which is another one we should
No, that
Oh, okay,
quote
yeah,
is from Think Rethink.
yeah.
And so we believe mistakes are teachers. It's important. Another important thing about accountability is it's important to be explicit about the norms and mechanisms in place to name and report harm. Like, do we call each other in one-on-one? Is it possible for us to do it in the group? What does that look like? Can we call in a third party? Who is that third party? Is there an anonymous reporting mechanism? All of those things are really important when you're asking folks to know how to engage those practices.
Yeah, because especially if someone's in a trauma mindset and there's a high degree of uncertainty over what will happen if they report, if they ask for help, if they bring it up, that's an incentive to keep it to yourself and not seek help.
And then in responding to harm, we acknowledge intent because it's really important to know why something happened in order to shift that behavior, but we center the impact. And I know people say acknowledge intent and impact. It's important to us to center the impact and acknowledge the intent. And then finally, we have to keep in mind that accountability is not forgiveness. Just because someone addressed the harm, apologize, even shift their behavior, that doesn't mean that you have to forgive them. Those are not the same thing. And then the other practice is consent, and we're going to dig into that a little bit more. We don't have a ton of time, but
hopefully this is somewhat familiar to this audience.
So when we talk about consent in this sort of work, it's that all of our work, whether it's as the facilitator, the participants, our partners, all of our work must be voluntary, informed, and conscious choices that are reversible. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about coercion, but we map the power dynamics, and we have a really great power mapping tool that we'll present in one of our sessions at the NISCASA conference. I'm not sure exactly which one. And directly counter the structural and community-based coercion and pressure to A, victim blame or minimize the harm, B, scapegoat and discard the perpetrator, C, place all of the responsibility and labor on the survivor or facilitator advocate.
Right.
Like most consistently when people start trying to do this work, those are the three pressures that come up because of the way that our culture operates. And so when we think about consent, we also think about how we're going to intentionally mitigate those pressures in our processes. This is just the image that we usually use when we're doing trainings around consent. We have it on our Instagram. It's something you can use. One really important thing about this is that we don't necessarily believe that consent needs to be enthusiastic. People communicate in very different ways, and especially if you're trying something that you've never done before, like a transformative justice process, you might not be enthusiastic about it. You might just be like, okay about it. And that means that it requires more check-ins, more conversation about how it's going, but people aren't always enthusiastic, including people that I know who their most enthusiastic response is like, yeah, that's great. And so I think that that kind of prioritizes certain types of communication over others and knowing what you want before you're in it. And if you perform enthusiasm with something that you've never done before and then realize that you're not into it, it can actually be more difficult to articulate that you're not enjoying it because of the level of enthusiasm you communicated at the beginning. So that's one way that we deviate. The other thing is when we're talking about coercion, it's important to name what that is. So getting someone to do something that they otherwise would not have chosen to do, either because of pressure, abuse of power, which is where it's really important to map the power dynamics, use of force, or just unrelated incentives. And we can talk about this a lot more another time.
And that's the framework through which we understand most gender-based violence and most domestic violence or sexual harm. We really view it through the lens of coercion. You know, how intense were the dynamics, and how were those dynamics leveraged?
And people have natural responses to being coerced or to being pressured or, you know, harmed. These are natural biological responses rooted in the nervous system's instinctual self-defense. The ones that we usually hear about are fight, flight, and freeze, but it's really important to also name accommodate. And many of us who were socialized either as female or who, you know, maybe were socialized that we need to perform what people with power tell us in order to be safe, you won't actually get those responses. You'll get someone to just accommodate to what you want because of the extremeness of the power dynamics. And, or even maybe you begin with fight, flight, or freeze, and then it shifts to accommodate as the way to maintain yourself in that environment. And that's often a misconception when people are working with survivors, or especially people who are in ongoing relationships with folks who have been harming them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, and I think Peter Levine, and his he has, some resources that are specifically very survivor centered. We attended an amazing workshop that really helped us and a lot of people with him. And he does some retraining exercises for your nervous system. And that's a resource that could be good to check out if you're curious about that.
Yeah, and then when we're talking about this, it's really important to keep in mind, what do we mean by power? And so we'll do that quickly. I wonder if anyone can type into the chat, who has power in your life? Answers we usually get are my parents, because we work with young people. And then when we work with adults, we get my kids, which is interesting. We'll get my boss, my landlord, the police, the judge, God. Lots of the US government, my mom, my boss. Yeah, thank you, Christina, for putting that in the chat. And so it's important to name who has power first in order to identify what is power. So does anyone want to type in the chat, what do you think power means when you're thinking about these people having power in your life? Maybe we can even just get one contribution before we move on to the definition that we use. Yeah, bosses, my past training, government. Ooh, past training, that's deep. Resources I need. Yeah, so these people have the resources you need.
Yeah,
their
exactly.
Choice comes before yours. Totally, that's great.
Resources and agency. Yeah, so you have needs, you need to get them met. Some people have
greater access to resources.
Could gatekeep you from that.
Yeah, so there's an organization or a platform called Little Sis, and anyone's heard of Big Brother from 1984? This is kind of a play on that. It's a technical tool online for mapping power dynamics within the elite. And so we were originally trained to use this platform in our work with the Dream Defenders to be able to map relationships between private prisons and the political environment. And because they're mapping power, it was really important for them to have a definition for power. So their definition is, power is the ability to manifest your will despite opposition.
And that's rape culture, right?
That's the ability to do something without consent. And that can be really scary. And I think that often causes people to think of power as something that's bad. But I also really appreciate, we're passionate about Foucault, but this is a separate professor or PhD who kind of translated some of Foucault's ideas in a more digestible way. So these are more Foucault's concepts of power, but written by Kevin. Power is transformative capacity, the ability of an individual to influence and modify the actions of other individuals or organizations in order to realize certain goals. Power is not a particular form or type of change. It is, in a strictly value-neutral way, the medium of change. Power is what makes change possible, whether that change limits freedom or promotes it. And so as organizers, we're often talking about building power, building people power, power in numbers, just other ways that are not necessarily about having power over someone, but cultivating that transformative capacity.
Yeah, and this always makes me think of our friend who we used to work more closely with the Dream Defenders, Phil Agnew, has this really powerful chant that he does with people that's power, transformation, miracles. And I think it's interesting how when you add those things, this understanding of power, when you leverage transformation through whatever medium, things that you didn't think were possible become possible.
Like the concept of abolition that we were talking about earlier. There were a lot of people who didn't want that to change, and yet it was the power of, but there's a whole historical argument about why that happened, but it took power to make something happen despite opposition. And so it's not inherently a bad thing. And so it's really important for folks to reconnect with their sense of power. Got to close with Audre Lorde. To acknowledge privilege or power is the first step in making it available for wider use. Each of us is blessed in some particular way, whether we recognize our blessings or not, and each one of us somewhere in our lives must clear a space within that blessing where she can call upon whatever resources are available to her in the name of something that must be done. And so this is, everyone has some sort of power, and it's about really knowing how to redistribute that more equitably and help people grow that when they've been disempowered.
Yeah, recognizing your power, leveraging your power. If you identify as a person with privilege, or if you're, thinking about the privileges you hold, trying not to get into a shame spiral around that, but instead thinking okay, I have this. So what can I do with that?
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where, as facilitators and as advocates, as people who are employed doing this, we have a real privilege and power in this work. And instead of being ashamed over that, it's about knowing how to leverage it. And there's a great book, Trauma Stewardship, that really talks about how we can think about our roles as folks who are working with people who are in trauma. And it talks a lot about this concept as well.
Yeah. And so I don't think we'll have time today to walk through our safety plan. But just to kind of close with this, whenever we start working with someone, either who has experienced or perpetuated harm,
or training facilitators,
we start with a safety plan. If basic needs are not met, people cannot focus on the process. And everyone should fill it out, especially if you're, for a perpetuator, being in a state of crisis or not having basic needs met is a huge roadblock to taking accountability, because you don't feel like you're okay. And so you don't feel like you can take those steps to be vulnerable, maybe put yourself at risk, that is necessary to go through an accountability process.
And as a facilitator, or even folks who are in support roles in a process, it's really important to be able to map your boundaries. And there's a big boundary mapping activity, which is, what am I willing to offer? What am I not willing to offer? And what am I conditionally willing to offer or share? And that's really helpful to know before you're in the situation. So because there's a lot of different tools in it, we often do those in 3 sessions. The first session is really identifying your support system. That can be done in partnership with the pod mapping tool from the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. There's a link to that in the plan itself. And we always try to end the session on a high note, so it ends with identifying affirmations for yourself. The second session is usually about identifying patterns in your body of what signs do you have in your body when you're feeling overwhelmed or burnt out or anxious, and then what practices will you put in place to address that. And then sometimes that'll be done with habit tracking tools to be able to integrate those proactively, not just in response to being activated or triggered.
Yeah, and I think a big challenge that folks who are trying to practice transformative justice, especially outside of an organization or institution with resources, is just like, people are struggling. People need help. People need resources. People need healthcare, right? And you can't, as an individual, provide that to them. And so some of the, what we encourage people to do is to come up with a resource sheet locally. And so that could include a community center, organizations, hotlines, different medical facilities, shelters, different practitioners, especially ones who will take certain types of cases at a pro bono or low cost rate. And hopefully people who you have a good reputation in being values aligned, and ideally who you've kind of had some relationship with, of them knowing that you might be sending them people.
And the last thing is that this is a living document that changes over time. So this is something you should check in on regularly and be able to adapt and evolve as things go on, either in your life or in the process.
Yeah.
So we try to do it quarterly. We're not always as on top of it as we should be, but that's kind of the goal, at least in our retreats. So in closing, what we covered in this conversation was our story, some of our core values and practices in doing transformative justice around gender-based violence, some about safety planning, and what we're going to be doing at the NISCASA conference in June is a panel with, we're going to be interviewing folks from Insight, which I'm so excited about. And then we're doing 3 pretty long sessions, almost day-long sessions, one on gender-based violence beyond the binary, rethinking our framing of gender-based violence, another one on implementing transformative justice in your organization, and I'll say that also applies to implementing it in your university, and facilitating transformative justice accountability processes, including a role play for practice.
Yeah, and then I think we'll go into a little bit of Q&A. We can stay over a little bit, but this is going to be pretty much the end of the content. But if you're wondering how can I access some of your resources, I just want to put out a couple things. Chelsea posted a link to our website where on the front page you can download or access a copy of the safety plan, and maybe after, during the Q&A, we can pull that up and just kind of show people that. But that's an example of the safety plan that we use, adapted from social work. And then we also have a Cultivate Consent workbook that people like to use it has a lot of these tools, and I love it. And so you can get that on our website, Or we only
those only come in packs of 5 because we want people to actually do it with other people in their communities, so it shifts the culture, not just the individual. But if you only want 1 copy,
yeah, then you can become a subscriber to our Patreon community. And you can do that as low as $1 a month just to get access to resources. We have a Transformative Justice Toolkit. We do monthly webinars and Q&As for that community and share resources. And if you subscribe, I think at $5 a month, we'll send you zines as we come up with them. I'm really excited because we're going to have a Transformative Justice workbook in this format by the conference. So I'm really excited about that. We'll have those at the conference for a suggested donation. And then also you can get, if you're interested in our fictional books, you can also access those on our website, or at a certain level, we will send you signed copies from our Patreon.
Yeah.
And then, did I cover everything?
You can follow us on social media at
yeah.
Time to Spring Up as well.
Right. So at Time to Spring Up. And then, yeah, and if you feel like I just want to continue learning in this, I want the ability to ask questions, I would totally recommend the Patreon community because that's an ability for you to, yeah, basically just have like kind of monthly check-ins and ask questions about how this is showing up and receive resources.
And then I think Chelsea wants to mention a little bit more about the conference coming up.
Yeah, thank you. I put this in the chat, but I'd love to share too a little bit of context. Today's webinar is part of a webinar series called Ending Violence Without Violence, which is serving as lead-up programming for a conference of the same name that Stas and Lea referenced. The webinar series is designed to introduce folks to a lot of the concepts and frameworks behind the conference, namely restorative justice, transformative justice, community accountability, and other violence prevention models and intervention models. The conference will be held June 3rd through 6th in this June. We're really, really excited for it. The website just went live, so that's endviolence2020.com. I also put that URL in the chat, as well as a link to sign up for updates. So you can stay tuned with, you know, when we can announce new speakers, when the next webinars are coming up. And yeah, thank you, Stas and Lea, so much for sharing your expertise and your wisdom. And yeah, I'm happy to open it up to Q&A.
Cool, and I think, yeah, we can stick around for, you know,
A couple minutes.
Yeah, I would say about 10 minutes.
Perfect.
Max.
Yeah.
So there's one question that maybe is quicker to answer. Where can we learn more about accommodate? So one of the trauma responses you covered.
Yeah, definitely. I'm hesitant to say any one individual theorist, or because this is something that's being studied right now. They're proposing that there are, you know, multiple responses. I really like Peter Levine in his framework of understanding kind of like the somatic biological responses to especially intimate partner trauma and sexual harm. But yeah, I think that I would kind of start with that. And then Bessel van der Kolk, who, you know, has also been called out for some harmful behavior, but has some really solid content about trauma.
Isn't there a recent article you were talking about that talks about it?
Yeah, and maybe I will find that and share that with Chelsea. Yeah.
I've also heard it referred to as fawning as another response.
Or appease, right?
Yeah.
Like freeze, appease. And that's so much of the behavior that gets like just categorized with a lot of victim blaming scripts. And I think that, yeah, it's really important to understand that that's a very supernatural response to,
as in very natural.
Yeah, not like mystical. Yeah, very common, especially when you're talking about ongoing relationships, especially when you're talking about domestic violence, intimate partner violence,
or workplace
violence. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple of kind of complex questions. The first, someone who comes from a community that penalizes people for reporting sexual abuse to law enforcement. But some of the systems that the community has put in place that don't involve the criminal legal system don't seem to work. The question is, do you have advice for a community in this kind of situation?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't have like a one size fits all, like your
Mm-hmm.
processes aren't working, you should do this approach
Mm-hmm.
instead. So I think there's not like an easy answer to that. I think that it also depends on what kind of community you're talking about, right? So like if you're talking about an intentional community or even like a community of people who have shared values, or you're talking about a reservation even, the practices put in place through the state might also be, or through the administration might be very different from the state responses we're used to. And then I also would just challenge the idea that these things don't work. I would also bring back to the concept of accept incompletion. These things take a really long time, and just that, you know, it needs to be adaptive based on the context. And so I would just recommend like all the things we've been talking about. There are so many books, so many examples, and it might just be that the infrastructure that the community has put in place isn't actually the one that is most culturally aligned with that community, or most aligned with the capacity that people have. So I would just think about redesigning it. There's so many models and examples out there. There's not one that works for everyone, and that's probably why things might feel like they're not working, because you might have chosen a model that doesn't totally align with your community.
Yeah, and it's also very challenging if you're trying to develop this capacity on the fly because you've been thrown into trying to handle a situation. Proactive capacity building, so important. Having a study group, having, you know, there are, I think, collective action for safe spaces, and what's the organization that does the queer and trans intimate partner violence training?
Northwest Network.
Things like that have cyclical classes that people can participate in and sign up for. And I think some of that can be online or remote. And we're maybe going to have some online classes this summer as well, because this is a very common thing of like, people email us and they're like, I'm in this place, I'm dealing with this, like, what do I do? And I think it's very difficult when you're thrown into trying to solve a situation. You can also do a little bit of an audit, more formally if it's an actual like formal organization, informally if not. Ask people who have been involved in past incidents, what happened, what worked, what did they want? And especially if you start kind of with those survivor-led questions of like, what do you need? And what are you looking for? That might not be possible, you know? And then I think it's also very important, especially if someone believes that their life is in danger or that someone like might harm them or their children, not to shame people for calling the police.
Yeah, our infrastructure is not at the level of development that the police are. Like, think about how much money, think about how much time and energy and full-time people, like, and they're still messing up constantly. So we can't expect our communities that are often doing this for free or for very little labor, people who are doing it on the fly, to be able to accomplish the same level of like consistent outcomes as prisons and police. And I think that we don't currently actually have the infrastructure in place to tell people that they shouldn't call the police if they're in immediate danger.
Yeah, I think that's the cultural shift that many of us are interested in trying to participate in, is how can we build up that capacity so that when we tell people to not call the police, they have resources that they can turn to. And I think that's especially promising when it comes to mental health, and not calling the police for people in mental health crises.
I think that it's not about not calling the police, it's about not having the police be your first form of response. So there's definitely a point at which you've done what you can and the police need to get involved, whether that's interpersonally, done as much harm reduction, you've brought someone else in and the police need to get involved. It's not never call the police, it's don't have the police be your first line of response.
Great, thank you so much. We are at time and I really want to respect that time. So there are a couple of questions that I'll send to you as like a follow-up that we could address. But yeah, so thank you for everybody who stuck around the last 10 minutes too. And thank you so much to Stas and Lea.
Awesome.
Yes,
and we hope
really wonderful.
We hope to see some of you at the conference in June, but thank you so much for joining us.
And special shout out to some of the folks in our network who also joined this call. So wonderful to see your names in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll be sending out an email with links and resources and the recording. So stay tuned.
Awesome. Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you. I'm just answering some questions and then I'll close it up.
Yeah, no problem. I think some of these are easier. I'll just say really quickly, the one around self-care and preventing compassion fatigue, just that book, Trauma Stewardship, is so helpful. And doing the safety and self-care plan in advance.
Yeah, and then if someone is especially in a position of power and is causing repeated harm and does not want to take accountability for that, then you can't do a restorative or transformative justice process with them, because it needs to be consensual, and the person needs to want to take accountability. Or and so if they're not interested in that, then definitely doing direct action or trying to remove them from a position of power is a appropriate strategy.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Goodbye for real.
Yes.